From the most trusted names in local news, KDPG Sunday Edition.
Good morning and welcome to the KDPG Sunday Edition. Over the past 70 years, Pittsburgh has been in the forefront of several medical breakthroughs. One of those breakthroughs was the development of the polio vaccine by a group of researchers at the University of Pittsburgh led by Dr. Jonas Salk. It was a breakthrough that changed how mankind dealt with a devastating illness. One of the other major breakthroughs was the development of organ transplant surgery here in Pittsburgh. Dr. Thomas Starzl was the researcher, the scientist, and surgeon who perfected first kidney, then liver, and then other organ transplantation, which has saved the lives of thousands of people. Within the last year, an award-winning documentary movie, Burden of Genius, was made. It is a movie that chronicles the sometimes frustrating and disappointing journey by Starzl to ultimately reach his goal of perfecting the organ transplant.
I've always found that the best way to get a job done is to get the job done before anyone realizes what you're up to. I think the space between heroic endeavor and being an outcast is not all that great.
If you would like to see Burden of Genius, it is being shown beginning this Thursday, April the 12th at 4 and 7 in the evening at the Carnegie Science Center, and it's going to run through April the 18th. Right now, we are going to talk with the director of the film, Jardis Gradamus, about making this movie and about one that he has in the planning stages on the work of Dr. Jonas Salk. Joe Smito, the editorial writer for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, joins us for this morning's discussion. Jardis, thank you so much for being with us this morning on the KDPG Sunday Edition.
Thank you for having me.
I have seen the movie. You're going to see the movie. It is very well put together. It's a documentary on Thomas Starzl. Why did you choose to do the movie on Thomas Starzl?
Well, you know, a few years ago we were doing a movie about Jonas Salk, which you already mentioned, and we were looking for another Pittsburgh hero, actually, and Dr. Starzl is a lot less known than Salk ever was, of course, although he is very well known in the medical community. But it was such an amazing story to be, you know, that we just felt it had to be told. It's really a story of an outlier and somebody who changed landscapes.
And you were able to have this discussion with Tom Starzl, obviously, before he died, and he really opened up to you in a lot of things about not only how he chose this, but the frustrations of this, and some of the problems that, I'm going to call them problems, but that he had in his personal life as well, of just making his personal life work with the goal that he was trying to achieve.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we were that he trusted us. You know, the process started in 2014 when we did 15 hours worth of interviews with him over the course of a week. And not all the funding had come through at the time, so we just interviewed people who were close to him, a handful of other people. And then over the next couple of years, we kept on coming back and we kept on doing more interviews. And it culminated during his 90th birthday, when there were people coming from all over the world to kind of celebrate his birthday. So we were really, really lucky because it gave us access to people who we otherwise would not have gotten. There were many people who worked with him during the 80s who, of course, went out and set up their own transplant centers in their own countries. So we never could have gotten those people, and they all came back, and we did a marathon of interviews, back-to-back interviews. So in the end, we ended up with about 70 hours worth of interviews altogether. And so if you just do the math on it, we have a 90-minute movie. It was really about picking, snippets in a way, and try to find events that were representative and patterning them into the full movie. And as you've seen the movie, so we really wanted to focus on the time in Pittsburgh, the first 10 years, because that was really when organ transplantation just exploded. It had so many breakthroughs as far as immunosuppression drugs, and that was the most exciting time. And what was really amazing was that when he came here, there was no infrastructure for it because nobody was doing it, you know? And so he really had to create an infrastructure, a lattice work to for example, getting CEOs of companies to donate their jets so he could actually fly to a different city, procure an organ and then fly back here. You know, that all had to happen within 4.5 hours, or this person would die.
Well, Starzl died in 2017, I think, and it strikes me that this documentary that you made of him is probably the first of what will be many attempts to sort of assess his career over the next, who knows how many years, because his influence was so pervasive in so many aspects of transplantation.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think, there were so many, we interviewed patients, of course, a lot of the people who were working with him in the 80s, and he was a fearsome taskmaster. I mean, he really was, people were afraid of him. There were actually surgeons who said they would throw up beforehand, not because they were afraid of the surgery, but having to work with Dr. Starzl.
If I could throw this in the middle of your answer here, I had a long session with Dr. Starzl back in the mid to late 80s, and we followed him around for an entire day. And after the one conference that he has, they call M&M, he came out and they were ready to start to go retrieve several livers. And I'll never forget it. He's out in the hallway at the Scaife Hall, and he comes out and he says, okay, we've got 3 livers. So-and-so, why don't you go to Erie? And so-and-so, why don't you go there? And then he looks at this doctor who said, and Starzl says to him, are you on tonight? And he says, no, I'm off. He said, okay, you're going to go with me. So that's exactly the way, and there was no hesitation. That doctor gave up his day off.
Yeah. Yeah. And the stories that he was able to tell about that whole process of actually having to fly out and then, procure, because, the people who were donors were usually people who had been killed in a car accident because they were still healthy, but, they could use the organ. So that whole process was amazing that they were able to do that.
Well, he also, if I can say, changed the rules and regulations about being able to retrieve the organ and on something called, when you're brain dead, because otherwise they were considering that you were stealing an organ from someone who was still alive.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that was I remember that was a very, very big thing. As he says in the documentary, the science was running ahead of the laws and the rules that existed. And a lot of those things had to be kind of engineered as he was doing it, or we were trying to catch up to that.
What was the factor? What was the personality trait that allowed him to persevere in this, to know that what he was going to do was possible and that his critics were wrong? I think just perseverance. He just never quit. He never quit. And there were surgeons, as Noctile, who we were talking about earlier, who said, after so many failures, at a certain point, doctors would just give up. They just felt like they couldn't, keep on doing it. But these patients were going to die if they didn't get a transplant. They were going to die. So that was the difficult thing, And there's a lot of ethical questions, of course, that come up. But he just wouldn't quit, and he did his first successful transplant in 1967. Now, a lot of the things that he was discovering didn't pay off for decades afterwards, but he just, the survival rate was still very, very low at that point, only maybe 10 or 15%, and he incrementally kept on improving his techniques until in the 80s it just exploded, and they were doing 300 livers a day, or a year. Was there something not only about Starzl, but about the places he worked, Colorado and Pitt, that enabled him to persevere for so long and eke out success finally after so many challenges and so many disappointments?
I think he was always very, very controversial, and there's kind of this myth, I don't know if that's exactly true, that he was kind of run out of Colorado, He was looking for a place that would be open to him, and he really felt like Pittsburgh embraced him with open arms. And I think, he really loved being in Pittsburgh, and that's why he never left. That's one of the reasons why he stayed here, I think.
The interesting thing also about Starzl is that sometimes he would question himself on what he had done. Going back to that day we spent with him, we went with him to retrieve a pediatric liver from a young child who had died at the hands of his father, as a matter of fact. And we were in the ambulance, sirens going, on our way back to the plane, because as you pointed out, there's only a certain amount of time before the liver will no longer work. And he's there and he's starting to contemplate, because of all the different livers that they could have retrieved, and he said, or to transplant into the child waiting back here in Pittsburgh, and he said, I hope I didn't make a mistake. And it was really, to me, a revealing comment that this man who seems so confident over everything that he did, he can sit back and question himself sometimes.
Absolutely. And I think it took that kind of drive in order for him to succeed in the end. But I think in the end, it always came down to his patients. You know, he really cared about his patients. He would do anything for his patients. And yes, he did have a reputation for being relentless and ruthless in a way. But I mean, I think that's where we really discovered his humanity in a way. As he says in the documentary, you know, his patients were his family.
We obviously here in Pittsburgh want to make him part of Pittsburgh. I mean, and he was, but he didn't grow up here, and his first work was at the University of Colorado, the medical center out there. How big is Thomas Starzl to the medical community now?
I think he's well known. I mean, very, very well known in the medical community. I mean, I always kind of tend to compare him to the Steve Jobs in his field in a way. But I think lay people do not know about him.
Should he have gotten the Nobel Prize for medicine?
I absolutely think so. Yeah, as I understand that there are a lot of politics involved in that, and you know, Salk should have gotten a Nobel Prize as well, as far as I'm concerned. But it didn't happen.
Well, as with any of these people who are pioneers within their fields, and there were those who were opposed to Thomas Starzl getting the Nobel Prize because they didn't think he was had the right approach to it, and so I think that probably played a part in it as well.
Yes.
When the KDPG Sunday edition continues, we will discuss the plans for a new movie about another medical pioneer here in Pittsburgh, Dr. Jonas Salk, whose University of Pittsburgh research team developed the polio vaccine. That is coming up.